In the last section, we set up our initial list view implementation. Remember that list view exists for rendering a long list of items in a memory efficient fashion. Now, our list of data is not very large, of course, I mentioned that several times, but it's still worth getting familiar with the API. Inside of our library list component, we first initialized a data source for the list view, and then we created a list view component and passed it the data source that we created. The purpose of this data source right here is just a fancy little wrapper around the data that we want to actually show inside that list. And just about everything in here, everything up to this clone rows, is 100% copy pastable. If you go look at the official documentation, you'll see the exact same code as what you see right here. The only real customization we had to do was make sure that we passed it our list of data that we want to show on the screen. So the last thing that we left off here was instructing the list view on how to render a very particular row of the application. So we need to tell the list view, hey, if you want to render just a single row, like a single item inside this list, please execute the render row function right here. So because our render row function needs to return just like a single row, I think that maybe it makes a little bit of sense to make a new component to represent a single row rather than adding a bunch more JSX into this render list component. So let's make a new component called list item, and the purpose of it will be to just display a single item out of our list, or like a single row. So inside my components directory, we'll create a new component. So I'll make a new file, and I'm going to call it listitem.js. Then inside of here, we'll place in some of our usual boilerplate. I am going to make this a class-based component again, because I think that we might need some lifecycle methods or something like that in the future. So at the top, we will import React and component from React. And I'll say class list item extends component. We'll add in our render method, and I'm just going to leave it empty for right now. Just bear with me for a moment. And at the bottom, we will export default list item. And yeah, we're getting a complaint here that the render method should have a return statement, so we will take care of that in just a moment. Now let's go back to our library list and render or wire this thing up. So inside of library list, we will first import the list item. So import list item from list item. And then inside of our render row method right here, we need to make sure that we return an instance of the list item component. The real question here though is when we create this list item, so I'm going to return the list item, I need to somehow pass some configuration down into this list item component that says, hey list item, you are supposed to show like this particular library, right? List item, we can't expect it to just like magically figure out which item in the list it should be rendering. We have to be very particular in telling it, please show this item, like this item out of the list. So to help us out with that, the render row function is actually provided with an argument that we will call library. And so this argument right here, the first argument to render row, is the element in the list that it is trying to currently render, that the list view is trying to currently render. So at the end of the day, if I have our like say 8 or 9 items inside of our library list, I'm going to expect render row to get called maybe like 8 or 9 times, once for each library in our list. So I'm going to return 8 or 9, however many, different list items where each one is going to be rendering a different library. Now of course we need to communicate the library down into the list item so it knows what to render. So I'm going to pass the library as a prop to the list item. I'm just going to call it, again, library. As I've mentioned many times before, for components that we create, the names of props is completely up to us. We can decide any name we want. So I do not have to call this library just because this variable name is library right here. I could just as easily call it like item or whatever. I'm just choosing to call it library because it kind of makes sense to me. Okay, so now as the list view tries to render each row, it is going to show a list item. And it is now up to us to make sure that the list item is going to take this library prop and show something reasonable on the screen. So now let's flip back over to the list item and make sure we use that prop, add in some styling, and get a really nice row to display. Let's go ahead and take care of that in the next section. So let's take a quick break, and then we're going to work on our list item component.